evening and welcome to the Alchemical Tours podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Hind. I'd like to welcome Mike Crowley, who is joining us from San Francisco or near San Francisco?
Berkeley.
Oh, even better, over the bridge.
Yes.
I used to love the bookshop in Berkeley. Yes, I used to spend a lot of time over there. Yes.
Oh, it is the place for bookshops. Yes, we do have. They're thicker on the ground here than pretty much anywhere else.
Oh, that's great. Let me just introduce you. Well, first of all, one of the reasons for chatting to Mike today is that there will be a new edition of his very interesting book called The Secret Drugs of Buddhism, Psychedelic Sacraments and the Origins of the Vajrayana. We'll say some more about the book and what's new in the edition and all that later on. But I'd like to just start by reading a little bit from Mike's bio so people can kind of understand the diversity and interest that Mike Crowley himself presents and allows him to write such a book. So Mike Crowley was born 1948 in Cardiff, Wales, not very far from where I am now in Bristol. He began studying Buddhism with the Tibetan Lama in 1966, becoming an upasaka of the Kagyud lineage in 1970, being ordained as a Lama in 1988. In order to augment his Buddhist studies, he acquainted himself with Sanskrit, Tibetan, and Mandarin Chinese, which is very impressive, as I know from my own feeble attempts at some of those. Mike has lectured at the Museum of Asia and the Pacific, Warsaw, the Jagellonian University at Cracow, the Californian Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His work has been published in Fortean Studies, Time and Mind, the Journal of Archaeology, Consciousness and Culture, Psychedelic American, and Psychedelic Press UK. In January 2016, Mike received the R. Gordon Wasson Award for outstanding contribution to the field of entheobotany. He currently serves on the advisory board of the Psychedelic Sangha, an American organization of psychedelically-inclined Buddhists. He teaches Buddhism at the Dharma Collective in San Francisco. What question were you trying to answer when you set out to write this book?
Well, anyone who has any involvement with Vajrayana Buddhism, especially if they've taken empowerments or taken part in a Ghana chakra, will have been given a potion to drink, something called Amrita. Well, most modern formulations of Amrita are merely colored liquid with lots of blessings. Sometimes, when it's an empowerment of a wrathful deity, the Amrita is alcohol. Now, this is a clue that it was previously psychoactive. Earlier writings, like if you read the writings of Kagyud, who was a Tibetan, 14th century, I think, he makes it quite clear in his writing that not only is Amrita psychoactive, but if you don't get Amrita, it's not a real empowerment. Also, in a somewhat obscure text by Jojam Trungpa Rinpoche, he talks about the effects of Amrita. He wrote it in the catalogue for an exhibition, which included it was an art exhibition about the Silk Road, the art of the Silk Road, and he included a Vajrayogini shrine as part of the exhibit. He contributed the shrine, and he also contributed an article for the catalogue which explains the shrine a bit. And in the article, he says that that Amrita, the purpose of it is to intoxicate the distinctions between nirvana and samsara, for one thing. It's a very interesting piece. just 2 or 3 pages long, but it makes it quite clear that real Amrita is psychoactive, to say the least. And if we look at it linguistically, the first occurrence of the word Amrita, which, by the way, is Sanskrit for immortality, the first occurrence we know of it is in the Rig Veda, where it's used as a synonym for soma. Soma was the sacred psychoactive plant of the Vedic Brahmins. There are clues as to what it was in the Vedas, and further clues in the commentaries on the Vedas called the Brahmanas, but we don't really know what Soma was. It's basically detective work or guesswork to say what it was. Now, it had many synonyms, and Amrita was one of them. Yes. And by the way, this should not be confused with Amanita, which is Greek for mushroom. So this is Amrita, actually, which is Sanskrit for no death. In other words, immortality. Now, after the Vedic period, which kind of drew to a close about 500 BC, we no longer hear much about the Vedas after that. And we get the Upanishads and Vedanta, end of Veda, the completion of Veda is what Vedanta means. Yeah. But then, as a separate substance, it begins to be mentioned in the 6th century, and it picks up again in Buddhism. There is this use of Amrita. Well, the book is an investigation into what that substance was. Whether it is that now, I can't say. There may be a certain amount of real Amrita being consumed in secret by Vajrayanists. I can't say. I have anecdotal accounts, but nothing that I can point to and say this is the real use of Amrita. But so my book is basically an assembly of the clues and various deductions I have made therefrom.
Yeah, and I should say for people who are kind of approaching this book, the book for me was, quite. Personally, I've got a background as a Buddhist practitioner, and I'm somebody doing meditation. But I've also done some academic study as well of Indian religion and Buddhism. So one of the things I recognised in the book is that it is very rigorous. It's got, it's not just a set of superficial claims. It's actually got sources for all the claims, and it's a proper investigation. Going through a set of well-reasoned arguments to come to the conclusions. One of the things I really liked about the book, because I'm very interested in Indian religion, and anyone who's tried to get their head around Indian religion, very quickly finds out that it's a very complex thing on the ground. Some people who've never been to India or have never tried to study Indian religion might think that Buddhism is a mindfulness class at the local college, or they might think these are these sort of peaceful, silent people in orange robes, and that's the end of Buddhism. But very quickly, when you start to get under the surface of Buddhism, you realize that Buddhism is caught in a sort of complex kind of web of different traditions that have percolated up over hundreds, if not thousands of years into several different schools of Buddhism, of which Tibetan Buddhism, is perhaps the most colourful and remarkable and surprising, I think, for Western students. One further thing I would add is, I'm, I guess, in my, approaching 60, and I've got a lot of contemporaries who are also interested in Tibetan Buddhism. Most of them were there in the 60s and were trying some psychedelic substances, and then afterwards, in order to kind of deepen their experience or try and make any sense of that in their lives, ended up in Tibetan Buddhism. That seems to have been a pattern that many of my Tibetan Buddhist friends, when you kind of get to know them a bit, they say, oh yes, well, in the 60s I had this experience and I tried to make sense of it through Tibetan Buddhism. So, I think this book certainly is going to be of great interest to people who are involved with Tibetan Buddhism and who have ever been interested in how this fits with psychedelic substances and those experiences. And it kind of puts a whole new light on the fact that these are two different things, which I find, that was one of the things that I found really interesting when I saw your book a couple of years ago when the first edition came out. So I think it's a great book, and it will serve many purposes for people who have a genuine interest in either psychedelic experiences or in Tibetan Buddhism. But one of the things I would say is, I think there is going to be a certain amount of controversy around the book. And, some people are going to say to you, can any true Buddhist really be taking psychedelics?
It's a very good question. And I'm not really sure I know what a true Buddhist is. Is there in fact such a thing? Is there a definition of a Buddhist which we can look up and check it against? There have been books recently, most notably Zigzag Zen, edited by Alan Bodina and Alex Gray, which have discussed whether psychedelics are relevant to modern Buddhism. Well, I can only say there was a complete movement of Buddhists devoted to psychedelics in the past. I believe that Vajrayana originated as a form of Mahayana which used psychedelics. Whether these are real Buddhists or not, I don't know. If there are people who say, enlightenment is fine, but you're only allowed to get there by meditation.
Yes.
It's a bit weird to me. If somebody can offer you, a little pill that says take this and you'll be enlightened, I think, oh no, none of that for me. I'm just going to do meditation, thanks. Yes. It's like, what is the motivation for that?
Yes. I just wonder if it would be worth just. Not everyone's going to be familiar with what Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana are. Just perhaps giving a little bit of a landscape of, what is the broad ground that different types of Buddhism occupy.
Right. Well, I would say I would break them down into Hinayana, Mahayana, Vajrayana. I know Hinayana, the name lesser vehicle, is thought to be disparaging. And so people use the term Theravada instead. Well, Theravada is a tradition. It's like saying the Rinzai Zen is our what we're going to call Mahayana, but Theravada is not one of the 18 schools which are named as Hinayana schools. But to back up to your your core question, the original Buddhism didn't have vehicles. It didn't have different paths for different people. It was just the teachings of the Buddha as practiced by monks and nuns. There was no rule for lay practice in early Buddhism. If you wanted to practice Buddhism, you became a monk or a nun. And if you wanted to be a lay Buddhist, you supported the monks and nuns. Well, there was a movement around the 1st century AD. It started, we believe it started then, which included the use of meditation and other practices by lay people. And also it eschewed personal enlightenment in favor of universal enlightenment. And so the attitude was, I will abstain from enlightenment until everyone is enlightened. That's Mahayana. The Hinayana is still practiced in the Mahayana countries, though. Anytime you take a vow of a monk's vow, a nun's vow, or the bodhisattva vow, well, not the bodhisattva vow, the monks and nuns' vows and the layman's vows, the pansil, the panchasila, they are Hinayana. And so you find Hinayana, Mahayana in Tibetan Buddhism, it's in Japanese Buddhism. They are stages of practice. Vajrayana is a later development than Mahayana, and it offers various techniques. It says that, yes, the Vajrayana philosophy is all very well, but we've got fast techniques that will get you enlightened immediately. My suspicion, and well expressed in my book, is that these fast techniques are in fact psychedelics, but they also use mantras and visualizations and a lot of other techniques which are not prominent in Hinayana and Mahayana. That is not to say that they're not there. You do find mantras in Hinayana and so on, but that's the basic overview. That some people, like particularly in Japan, medieval Japan, said there's only one vehicle, and they called it the Ekayana, so it included all of those. And then again, you have Dzogchen in Tibet that says there are 9 yanas, and we supersede all of them. So it's it's a somewhat contentious subject. If anyone is interested, I do go into it a little bit in the book and explain what these various perspectives are.
Yes, I mean, I think one of the things I really welcomed in the book is, the books, for me, is something you could read in many different ways. You could read it from front to back, but there are also various sections you could just dip in and read. And I think you say that in the beginning, that there's the investigation you could just go straight into. But for those people who don't really know anything about Indian religion and so on, there's what I found a really interesting and well put together section which traces how religion moved into the Indus Valley, thousands of years ago, and through the geology, the geography, the history of tribal peoples moving, then the sort of establishment of the early Indian religions, the Vedas, where they were using fire sacrifices and this drink soma, which seemed to obsess various people in the 60s trying to work out what that was, and then how all that resulted in Buddhism in both India and Tibet. So I think there's a really nice, for those people who really want to get to grips with the history of Indian religion, there's the first third for the people who really want to go there. And although I've read a lot about it, I must admit I learned all sorts of things I didn't know, and it also put together various disparate bits of Indian religion that I'd never been able to put on any sort of map. So I sort of thank you for that. That I don't underestimate the work required to do that. I mean, something that interests me regarding that is, one of the things that's always intrigued me is the Buddha has often been called the Sramana, which I take to be shaman.
Well, now that's a very interesting bit of linguistic etymology there. It has been said that the Siberian term shaman, I believe it comes from the Chukchi language of Siberia. It came to Chukchi from Mongolian. The Mongolians got it from the Chinese, and it was shaman in Chinese, which was their version of shramana. So shramana was used to mean monk, Buddhist monk. Literally, it means listener, one who hears the teaching. And so it is quite possible that Eurasian shaman, I don't know what you'd call them if you don't call them shaman, but they may have adopted this term because it gave them a certain amount of automatic respect, and that yes, we're monks too, kind of thing. So that has been expressed as one of the origins, or a possible origin of the Siberian term shaman. However, I mentioned this at an archaeological conference at the University of Wales a couple of years ago, when I was giving a presentation there, and there was a room full of anthropologists who were all into shamanism, and my God, it was like, see those pigeons? Watch this rock.
yes, yeah. But I think the interesting thing, and this again you develop in the beginning of your book, is, and I think a lot of people might not really understand this because to my mind, certainly in Britain, history is taught in a very strange way. People aren't really given any true long-term view of history at all, really. They're giving a very selective view of some British triumphs. But if you kind of look back through prehistoric and ancient history, which you do in the book, you see that there was this amazing communication between Europe, areas like Mongolia and Siberia and Iran and India, that was going on in the sort of origins of Indian religion. So, the traditions that we might associate with, shamans or whatever we want to call them in Siberia, where we now know that they were taking, mushrooms such as the Amanita muscaria and so on, were being communicated down into Iran and into northern India. This is sort of a well-established fact now in anthropology and in history, and I think it's not something that most people really grasp. So it would seem very likely that those knowledge of how to use psychoactive mushrooms would have been communicated into the early DNA of Indian religion. And I think you make a very strong case of that. So, if that is the origin of Indian religion, then to me it makes a lot of sense to trace that through. What happens to that when you move into a country, maybe when that mushroom isn't available and the ritual doesn't quite work in the same way?
Well, I think that the Indo-Europeans, who called themselves Arya, who moved into northwestern India about 2000 BC, they had picked up the use of Amanita muscaria, I believe, during their stay for a couple of hundred years in the Oxus Valley. They came into contact with something called the Bactrian Margiana Archaeological Complex. I think is a horrible name for a civilization. Why do they call it the Oxus Valley Civilization or something nice like that? I don't know. Anyway, these people seem to have had fire rituals and drugs, and they particularly Amanita muscaria, which is still used in that area, northern Afghanistan. It's still in use there. Anyway, they migrated into northwestern India, and they experienced a period of disappearing forests. They spoke of the divine forest. So the Amanita muscaria mushroom requires trees. It requires specific trees to have a symbiotic relationship with their roots, called a mycorrhizal relationship. It breaks down to Greek words that mean mushroom root relationship. So it's much easier if you think of it that way. So they may also have come into contact with indigenous use of a different mushroom, which they recognized as another way of religion, another way of spirituality, but different from their own. When we get to, say, the Yajur Veda and the Atharva Veda, the later Vedas, we find references to two kinds of Rudras. They say, the Yajur Veda, the white Yajur Veda says, there are thousands of Rudras scattered about the face of the earth. Now,
it might be just worth explaining what Rudra is.
Yes, I was just about to.
Yeah.
Yes, so it has many meanings, which we can deduce from the Vedas. One is that Rudra is a god.
Yes.
And in another sense, it is the raw plant that soma is made from. And when we say, when you see the plural Rudras, it seems that they're talking about plants. They're talking about things that grow at any rate. And they say quite clearly there are two kinds of Rudras. There's the red Rudras and the blue-throated Rudras. Now, blue throat, Nilakanta, can be seen as a simple pun on blue stalk or blue stem, which is Nilakanta. So this is also a name of Shiva. Shiva and Rudra were conflated as being one and the same in later periods. So my contention is that as the Amanita sources dried up, they took over the indigenous mushroom and started using that. There is some evidence for this in the Brahmanas, which, first of all, the early Brahmanas tell you how to recognize good soma and not to be sold fake soma, how to recognize bunk. And then eventually the last ones tell you what substitutes to use for soma. It's obvious it was disappearing. And I find it very amusing, actually, it's rather brutal, but in the Brahmanas, they tell you how to behave towards the soma seller. And the soma sellers are always indigenous tribes. They're not Brahmins. They're not Arya. They're people from the northwest, is what they say. They're the northwest of the Doab, the land between the two rivers where the Arya lived. Now, it doesn't just say, as it does, beware the soma seller. The soma seller is evil. The soma seller is a cheat, and so on. Apart from just those like vague warnings, it tells you precisely how you are to beat up the soma seller with, and what kind of stick to use to hit him with.
Yes.
So And it says, show him your best cow, then after he's given you the soma, give him your worst cow. And if he complains, hit him with this stick. It's if anyone's interested, it's a spotted cane that you're supposed to strike him with.
Yeah.
So
I love the precision of Indian texts. They they think of everything, don't they? It's like yes.
Yeah, quite so.
I mean, if we fast forward into India today, I mean, there's a number of things. There are many different traditions, that are alive and well in India, and it's almost you can find just about everything going on in India today. Everything that used to be going on over the last 1,000 years is still going on somewhere if you can find the right yogin or the right tribe, and it seems quite obvious that many psychoactive substances are being used on a daily basis by nagas and yogins wandering around India. I don't know what your experience is, but you can find Shaivites smoking cannabis, taking datura, taking various substances. So
smoking scorpion stings.
Yes.
Smoke scorpion stings. I don't know what it does, but they seem to get high on it.
And if you look at the history of Buddhism, then at some point, there were these different types of Buddhism around India in that diverse landscape. But then there was the invasion, wasn't there, of the kind of Muslims into the north of India. So we've got various sort of snapshots of what northern Indian Buddhism used to be out on the margins, in Tibet and Nepal and so on.
It's very common for people to say, "Oh, this Vajrayana stuff is like the marriage of Mahayana and Tibetan indigenous practices as represented by the Burn religion." Well, this is nonsense. Vajrayana came from India and is also practiced in China and Japan. And these terrifying, wrathful deities, which are a feature of Tibetan Buddhism, the very same deities and with the very same wrath are found in Shingon Buddhism in Japan.
Yes.
So, yes, it was part of Indian Buddhism. You mentioned the invasion of the Muslims about in the 14th century in India, but about 1,000 years earlier, there was the invasion of the white Sakas, who came in from the north. We know very little about these people, apart from the fact that they were a branch of the Scythians, who were also called Sarmatians or Sogdians, and Tantra seems to have exploded onto all of the Indian religions about the same time, subsequent to the Saka invasion. I am somewhat loath to make a connection there to say it was brought by these people, but it does seem suspicious. Oh, a little fact that that I didn't mention earlier when I mentioned the Hinayana, Mahayana, Vajrayana. It was thought that the Hinayana scriptures came first. The suttas of the talks of the Buddha, called sutta, which means thread, by the way, because books were held together by threads in those days. And Tantra means weave, so it's like an extra dimension on the suttas. Well, the Mahayana versions are called sutras because that's the Sanskrit equivalent of the Pali sutta. Well, so that was for 100 years, over 100 years, that was the schema. We thought first there were the Pali language suttas, then there were the Sanskrit sutras, and then the tantras. just recently, about, I don't know, 15 years ago, Sanskrit sutras were discovered in Afghanistan. Well, we know that Afghanistan, the area we now call Afghanistan, was a Buddhist kingdom in ancient times. It was Greek-speaking Buddhist. And they have just found sutras older than any sutras that anyone has found. So this kind of upsets the apple cart, if you like, as far as like which came first. It's the Mahayanists always said that the Buddha taught this stuff, and the Hinayana or Theravada, whatever, said no, he didn't. He's not in our canon, and so that's it. Just goes to show how much is guesswork, how much we really don't know about this early stuff.
Yeah, I mean, what I find interesting is that, I think we've learned a lot over the last 50 years. And, there was some early idea of what Buddhism was, taken by having met certain Buddhists in certain geographies and taking that as the whole. Now I think academic Buddhists, if you read something like Mahayana Buddhism by Paul Williams or any of the sort of later books, they all seem to just recognize that, Mahayana was the deep Buddhism that people were doing in the forests and the mountains, and that it is as old or older than the Theravada. This is kind of established academic fact now, whereas a lot of people have the newsletter that was put around 20 years ago that said something else because we just didn't really know. So, I think academic Buddhism has caught up, but a lot of the books are out of date, and a lot of people's ideas are out of date. And that's one of the things, again, that I like in your book, that you've kind of brought your research up to date and quoted sources. And if people really want to have the argument, they've got the materials in there in the sources to really go back and find out whether their own arguments are valid, which I think is really good. One of the things I wanted to kind of move on to is, perhaps framing a little bit or allowing people to understand what Amrita and these substances might mean within the context of modern Tibetan Buddhism. I suspect many people have a view of Tibetan Buddhism, which is, the Dalai Lama giving a public talk in a very nice way that doesn't offend anyone, in a very sort of nice way. And they think that is the whole of Buddhism. I remember one person saying to me once, who was a Christian, she said, well, one thing, how can we disagree about Buddhism? It's only stuff that all of us could agree about, isn't it? And, I didn't say anything, but I thought, well, the less you know, the better, in some ways. But, I think one of the things about Tibetan Buddhism that is, comes out in your book is that there are levels of secrecy which have been maintained over hundreds or thousands of years. And in order to, as people slowly enter into Tibetan Buddhism, they go through empowerments and initiations. It seems a little bit like the mystery traditions in ancient Greece, where you had to be go through the initiation ceremony, and then you were told a secret. And
there were levels in the mystery traditions. You could be initiated into the outer secrets, and then there were the inner secrets, at least in Eleusis. So it is very similar. It is, I agree. And some people have suggested a connection between the initiatory cults. Yes, so there was the first book written in Tibet about Tantra generally. The first book that was not just a translation of an Indian text, but the first book written for Tibetans explaining what Tantra was. It was written in the 11th century um, by a member of the Sakya lineage. The Sakya is one of the new translation schools started in the 11th century. They in the book about Tantra, they say Tantra is wrapped in secrecy. In fact, there are 7 levels of secrecy. So even if you have an initiation, don't think that you're going to get all the secrets, because you're not. And only when you're maybe a heart disciple of a teacher would he divulge the secrets. My own teacher said that his uncle announced, he was a monk, his uncle announced that he was going to die. He said, I'm going to die next Saturday. Well, actually, he said, I'm going to die next Thursday. And the people all around him at the dinner table said, oh, no, that's a terrible idea. Thursday is a terrible day to die. That's very inauspicious. And he said, oh, how's Saturday? Oh, he said, all right, I'll hold my breath and stop my heart beating so that I will extend my life till Saturday. And because according to Tibetan traditions, you only have so many breaths and so many heartbeats. And so in the intervening period, he wandered around the streets outside the monastery, divulging all the innermost secrets. And my teacher said he would just stop people in the street and tell them the secrets. And they were completely baffled. They had no idea what he was talking about. So it just goes to show a lot of the secrecy is what they call self-secret, rangsang. It's you can tell the secret to somebody, but if they don't understand what you're talking about, it's still secret.
Yes, it's like the what's that novel? The something letter where it's in plain sight all the way through. And
the purloined letter.
That's right. Yes.
Oh yes.
Yes, I love that idea. And particularly in the Dzogchen tradition, there's a lot of this self-secret, isn't there, about that tradition. Which is,
things that you can't actually convey in words. In the Dzogchen tradition, particularly, there are stories of teacher and student just sitting together until the student's mind is clear and precise, and the guru says, "There, that one." It's just pointing out instructions. It's called.
Yes. So, how? I mean, I guess there's kind of a few implications of your investigation. To my mind, there are a number of sort of false conclusions people could very easily draw from this. But nevertheless, it's sort of, it's like that there is a cross here be dragons, here be something worth investigating. Is one take-home message. But I guess the sort of questions you might ask is, will taking psychedelics make me a good Buddhist or an enlightened person or a better person?
Well, the simple answer to that is no. No, it won't. If Chodron Trungpa said something, he said, people on the spiritual path will often go for something that it seems like it will give an easy fix. You'll get enlightened easily. There are no easy fixes, is what he said. If it doesn't involve working on yourself, working on your own flaws and your own deficiencies, it's not going to work. If you've got a method technique, well, that technique has to be able to transform you as a person. And if you don't want personal transformation, nothing is going to work.
Yeah.
So it's will they work automatically? Probably not. Can they work? Yes, definitely. And I would say it needs practice. I would say also it needs a guru. For a guru is not somebody that says, I'm going to tell you how it is, and you will worship me because of it. No, that's a modern self-appointed guru. Someone who is truly a guru. Their attitude is they want to make you a guru too. And so in my tradition and our tradition, I think, it could be an event. It doesn't have to be a person. It could be a thing. You might accidentally step in a pile of dog shit, and that could be your guru. That could be your, you could become enlightened because of that. Anything which brings about a deeper understanding of yourself, the universe, the nature of mind, these are gurus. And it doesn't have to be a guy in robes. It doesn't even have to be a Buddhist. It doesn't even have to be human. But anything which brings about enlightenment is a guru. And that's what you need to use the psychedelics to their fullest extent.
Yeah. So what is your intention for this book? I mean, you obviously have thought a lot about the book, and there's a lifetime of your own experience in this book. I would guess.
True. Just writing the book itself took about 25 years. Yes. It started with like, that sounds like psychedelics to me, and that's. I'll tell you, I read the Dreame Xiaotrang is a Tibetan, an old Tibetan text from the Nyingma tradition. And it's probably, although we don't know this, it's very likely to be a translation of an Indian Sanskrit text. The name means the Immaculate Crystal Garland, but like most Tibetan works, the name gives absolutely no clue as to what the book is about. And it's just like, that was a good title. I think I'll use that for my book. And so I'll back up a bit. In the Indian tradition, in the Puranic tradition of Indian Hinduism, there's a very important myth about the creation of Amrita. And it's so important that it's like 7 or 8 versions of it in the Puranas. And there's one in the Mahabharata. And it describes, among other things, how Shiva got his blue throat as a byproduct of making Amrita. So we know it's about Amrita, and we know that the blue throat is in there somewhere. So there's lots of stuff that you can deduce from the regular story of the churning of the ocean of milk, by the way. Oceans used to be made of milk, but then the gods churned them and turned them into water and Amrita. Anyway, the Dreame Xiaotrang describes a Buddhist version of the churning of the ocean. And they make Amrita and they give it to this nice, mild-mannered bodhisattva, golden-colored bodhisattva called Vajrapāṇi. And for some reason, he doesn't look after it very well, because when his back is turned, it gets stolen by a demon called Rahu. And the demon drinks it all, the entire world supply of Amrita, all of it. He drinks it. And he doesn't stop there, but he replaces it with his own urine. He drinks the entire pot of Amrita, then pisses into the pot. As punishment for Vajrapani, this is very strange, like Buddhist punishment. Vajrapani is made to drink the urine, and he becomes wrathful, dark blue, muscular. His golden ornaments turn into snakes, and he develops this intense hatred of demons. Well, whenever you take an empowerment of a wrathful deity, they tell you he's not really angry. The anger, the wrath, is a symbol. It means he's highly energized. Now, I think it means he's stoned. Now, maybe your viewers don't know this, but the practice of eating Amanita muscaria in Siberia among shamans involves drinking their urine. Yes. Because of a very peculiar pharmacological feature of Amanita muscaria. It is possible to excrete more of the psychoactive substance, muscimol, than you actually ate in the mushroom, because there's something called ibotenic acid, which your liver turns into muscimol. Yeah. So there is a very good reason for drinking urine. Yeah. So this was a clue that it was actually about Amanita muscaria, and that was the first thing that I filed away, and various other things came to note as my practice developed, as my experience of Buddhism developed. And I filed them away and eventually came to write the book. It was about, let me see, 1994, I think it was. A friend of mine said, you should write a book about this stuff. And it's taken me till now to get it out there. Yeah.
I was interested in one of the new sections in the new edition. So we should say to everyone that the second edition of the book is due out in October. In
October the 8th.
Yeah. So that'll be available in bookshops, Amazon,
yes.
The usual places.
Yes.
I'll put links on my Alchemical Tours website so people can follow those and buy the book while they're listening. But one of the new sections in the second edition, which I really liked, was the Chulen.
Chulen, yes.
Because it there's a big tradition within Tibetan Buddhism of making pills and living off just pills and medicine while on retreat, and it occurs in a lot of the stories of famous yogins who've kind of gone off, some of them quite modern, who've kind of gone off into the Tibetan mountains and gone on retreat for months, if not years, and kind of lived off the essences, I think is the term they
That's
use.
true. Yes.
Now, in your Chulen section, you start to talk about recipes that are used to make Amrita pills. So I was very intrigued by that. They're quite complex, some of them, aren't they? And
yes, some have hundreds of ingredients, hundreds. And some of them are not psychoactive ingredients at all. It's like, something which once touched the hem of the robe of a famous guru. That's the kind of thing that you'll get in them. But that being said, there are certain plants which are notable as being ingredients in these. There are, for instance, a couple of species of Codonopsis, the roots of Codonopsis. You can get seeds for these online. And there is there is something called Dakini's radish, which is a 7-foot tall rhubarb. It's not a radish at all, but it's a psychoactive rhubarb, which grows on mountainsides in the Himalayas. So yes, I've included a few of these things, and
there's some idea there's a white and a red version of Amrita.
Yes. Oh yes. The white pills and red pills.
So tell us the significance of those white and red. I think you've only got the recipe for the white.
Oh, the red.
The red.
I don't have the recipe for the red for the white pill.
Yes.
Yes, white and red are complementary in they're the yin and yang of Vajrayana, and the white is said to represent semen, and the red menstrual blood. But in another sense, they could be a red mushroom and a white mushroom.
Yes.
There's when you do the meditations which involve chakras, you have white channels and red channels with these red and white atoms, if you like, called bindu, which travel along these channels. I'd just as an aside, I'd like to say every tantra, and there are hundreds of tantras, has its own system of chakras and colors and petals and veins and so on. So the system of chakras, which is promoted in the West in New Age publications, is very, very limited, and that's just one, and one very late one at that. There are, if you actually practice the tantra, you see that each deity has its own system of chakras. Anyway, that being said, the internal energy systems of the deities are red and white, and blue. If you combine red and white, they become blue, apparently. So it's these things are all shrouded in secrecy, however, and I can only talk about so much of it, but I can't give details.
Yeah, I'm interested in this idea of these pills. There seems to be, from my own kind of studies of Buddhism, there seem to be, having met, Tibetan lamas and practitioners, often they give out pills at ceremonies
Yes.
and things to people, and
Yes.
I think one lama said to me that whatever you do, don't take this unless you're dying. So you sort of wondered what was in it, So yes, I suspected there was mercury in it or something. There was.
Right. There often is. Although they tend to make it into a salt, a mercury salt, which is said to be non-toxic. I don't know. I've never tested it, so.
Yeah.
Yes, there are Amrita given out, and I would just like to say that some meditations are visualizing making Amrita inside the body. Inside you make your own endogenous Amrita, and to do so, you imagine a skull cup, that is an inverted human skull, the top of a skull used as a cup, and in it is inserted, again upside down, a katvanga, which is a staff. Now, if you imagine the katvanga being inserted into a skull cup in order to make Amrita, that if you turn them in the right way up, they make a mushroom.
Yes.
The shape of a mushroom. And so here again, we have, a connection between, a meditation, Amrita, and a mushroom. mushrooms are not the only thing I mentioned in the book. I also have an Indian version of ayahuasca mentioned in the book. And also in the new edition, I have a piece on grasses, which there are various grasses which are considered holy in India, which are hosts for an endocytic fungus, that is to say, a fungus which is passed on in the seeds of the plant. They pass it on to the next generation. And this fungus creates ergolides, that is to say, substances similar to LSD. And they create it in greater quantity than ergot. And so the Indian tradition is that this grass, Poa Kinesiroides, it's called Kusha or Durva in India, it is touched with soma. And I think that means that sometimes it contains the psychoactive fungus and sometimes it doesn't. That's why it's touched with soma.
Yeah, it figures in the life story of the Buddha, doesn't it?
Oh, yes. He uses it for his seat. Absolutely, yes.
We better not go there, but yes, it begs the question, doesn't it? Yes. Yeah. And there seems to be, I mean, the other thing that you describe in your book is this whole idea of the treasure tradition of, particular objects being hidden in Tibet, particularly in the Nyingma tradition, such as texts for future generations, maybe practice objects, but also pills. There seems to be these sort of stores of pills that are discovered by great, Tertons over centuries, and some of them explicitly say that they've got excrement and from Guru Rinpoche or
exactly.
Geshe Segyal or whatever. Yes, which comes back to your arguments here of particular, the role of the excrement of the guru somehow.
Well, in the Mahayoga Tantras, one of the 4 classes of Tantra, they make reference to excrement and urine, and say to practice properly, you have to eat excrement and drink urine. Now, but this is very interesting, as it comes in a version of the 5 vows that you get in Hinayana, and it says, whereas the 5 vows are not to kill, not to lie, not to steal, not to have sexual improprieties, not to take intoxicants. Well, it says you must kill, you must lie, you must steal, you must have sex with your sister, your mother, your grandmother. And when it comes to, it doesn't say you must take intoxicants. No, it says you must eat excrement and drink urine. So I think eating excrement is eating the mushrooms that grow from cow dung. Drinking urine refers to Amanita muscaria and the practice of recycling the urine once you've eaten it. So I think these practices are Western scholars say, oh, they're just transgressive. They're just going to, be transgressive and break the rules. Well, no. If you actually read the commentaries, it says, for instance, you must have sex with your sister, your mother, your grandmother, your daughter. It's your sister is someone who's, it's explained, someone who's had the same initiations as you. Your mother is the wife of your guru. Your daughter is someone that you are the guru of. And so there are very explicit explanations for each of these, but they don't explain what the excrement and urine are, and not in the commentaries.
I mean, the other thing that exists throughout Buddhism, through all three vehicles, is the idea of siddhis or powers that can be acquired during the Buddhist path. That are, some of them are downplayed, but I think in the book you list those. And one of them, is it pill making or?
Yes, Buchara is the city of making pills. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. And there are also, going back even to the Hinayana, there are riddhi as well, which are supernatural powers, clairvoyance and so on. That and it says, don't concentrate on these. They're just, the Visuddhimagga says one of the riddhis is bilocation, being in two places at once. And it says, guys, if you can do this, please don't. It confuses the hell out of people. Yes. So making pills is one of them. There is a tantra, the tantra of Mahamaya, the great illusion woman. And it's mostly about making pills. The tantra is devoted almost entirely, it's a short tantra, it's devoted almost entirely to how to make pills. There is also, to answer your question much earlier about how modern Tibetans view this stuff, well, it depends. There is an advanced lama, a very good teacher who speaks excellent English, was the grandson of the great Dilgo Chense Rinpoche, and his name is Dzongsa Chense Rinpoche. And he has gone on record as saying that psychedelics are or can be used in the path. He actually there's a YouTube video where he talks about peyote even. Yeah. And he says, I had a little peyote juice before I came on. It hasn't started working yet, but and so here's he says explicitly that this is mentioned in the tantras. We have techniques of using these substances, and it's mentioned in the tantras. And if you don't believe me, I can give you page numbers.
I mean, I guess one of the questions for Western Tibetan Buddhists is, whether or not they've been sold short on what Tibetan Buddhism is, and what is the path to enlightenment, and whether or not now there is this kind of increased awareness of these traditions. There's the whole set of people who've been heading out to South America to try ayahuasca, and that perhaps a new understanding of sometimes good, sometimes bad, of what that tradition's about, and the whole aspect of Gordon Wasson going to Mexico and discovering the traditional use of the magic mushroom in a healing context, and now there's the anthropological understanding maybe of the shamanic tradition in Siberia. Our awareness is very different from 1959 when the Tibetans first came over to India and Tibet.
Shortly before Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche left Britain for the United States, he spoke to my teacher, who was a lifelong friend, and my teacher told me that Trungpa had said, I'm going to teach Vajrayana. I'm going to teach Tantric Buddhism. But there's one aspect of it which I'm going to leave out, because I know Westerners and they will just abuse it. And so I'm not going to teach that part. I think he was talking about psychedelics. And I think it's the duty of Western Buddhists, Tibetan Buddhists especially, to hold these guys' feet to the fire, to say, yes, we know that you are using psychedelics. Don't pretend that you're teaching Tantra if you're not giving us the psychedelics as well. Um, so, in the East, in India, if you ask someone if they practice Tantra, they might respond with, "Oh no, I don't do that stuff because I don't do drugs." And this is actually written in a scholarly book. I'm sure you'll find somewhere. It's called Tantra in Practice. And in the West, we think of Tantra as to do with sex. In India, it's to do with drugs. If you read the Tantric tradition by Agahananda Bharati, he explains the Hindu version of tantric sex. And first he says you have to get high. He says you have to drink bhang, cannabis milkshake first. And so, yes, I think we have been sold short. I think it's that there is an element missing, and my book is about that element.
Yeah, and maybe the context in which Tibetan, there was this sort of diaspora of lamas and Tibetan Buddhism into the West in the 60s, and it coincided with the sort of psychedelic revolution and LSD and all that, which was, perhaps fueled by maybe more of a, for the most part, a hedonistic or a kind of party use of psychedelics. Maybe that atmosphere itself made Tibetans wary of the maturity of Western.
It did. I'm sure it did. It was. I practiced. I was into Tibetan Buddhism quite early on, as you know, from '66, and I knew somebody who lived with Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche in a hippie commune in Westbourne Grove in London, and he said that Trungpa took LSD with them, but then criticized the hippies for not taking it seriously enough. He said, "Oh, your use of LSD is too frivolous," and he also said that we have stuff in Tibet that's stronger than this.
Yes.
Called Dutsi Rilbu, which is the Amrita pills that you were talking about.
I mean, that's all very intriguing and interesting, I'm sure. And it sort of implies that, I think when I first read through your book, you end up understanding this sort of use of soma in India and the early traditions associated with the use of psychedelics. And I think the question then arises, having read the book, well, is this a secret tradition that's still going on? Or is this something that was, people lost touch with over the centuries in Tibet themselves? But from what you're saying, it seems that this is still going on, certainly for, Tibetan Buddhism is a broad church, isn't it, in Tibet? You've got, I think you say this in your book, you've got tulkus who are really just the relatives of various people who've been appointed to various positions and called tulkus. And, you've also got a small number of practitioners such as Chogyam Trungpa or such as these Dilgo Khyentse who you mentioned, who are at the core of all the secrets and the secret tradition.
I think that's absolutely correct. And there is a distinction which is not often made between the red and white sanghas. We spoke of red and white earlier, but the red sangha is the community of monks and nuns. The white sangha are the yogic practitioners who are supposed to wear white and wear their hair long. I think it is among the the white Sangha that you're more likely to find the use of these psychedelics.
Yes. And, traditionally, it's going right back to the early Mahayana again. There seems to my mind, to be two sets of movement, two movements within Tibetan Buddhism, as seen in a slightly different way. There's the people in the villages and towns around local monasteries, going to the monasteries for blessings, going on pilgrimages and so on. And then there's this kind of small group of practitioners who are away from the population for a lot of the time, doing secret practices in remote places. And it might in India have been in the charnel grounds or in the forests or the mountains. In Tibet it might have been in the mountains, and so on. So it's almost like there's the Catholic Church of Tibetan Buddhism, which is wide and universal, and there's the sort of secret, brotherhood and sisterhood, I guess, of people who are following something which wasn't widely known in Tibet itself, never mind in the West.
I think that's quite accurate. I have anecdotal evidence from people in the West who have consumed real Amrita, for instance. And I spoke to somebody who drank a bottle of Amrita concentrate and was out of his head for 5 days, getting teachings from Dakinis and all kinds of hallucinations. But I haven't put that in the book, as I've not been given permission to publish it. I'm telling you now, but I'm not giving you any names.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
So I think there are, especially in the lay lineage, the married lamas, the householder lamas, who are also involved in the terma tradition, as you say, the stashes of pills that were found, and so yes, there is a lot to be explored, a lot still to be investigated. People often say to me, "Oh, what are the secret drugs of Buddhism?" Well, in this latest edition, I do have a table of all the drugs, all the plant species mentioned in the book. And there are 72 of them, so it's not easy to just rattle them off. There are some major players and some minor players. I would say the major players being the mushrooms, the Indo-huasca, as I've called it, ayahuasca based on the Kadira tree, which contains dimethyltryptamine, and maybe the grasses which contain the ergolines. I think they're the major players, but we have stories of the 5 meats and the 5 elixirs, which I think are the 5 meats being the 5 source plants and the 5 elixirs being the teas made from them. These were consumed as a single panchamrita, it was called, 5-fold elixir. This, by the way, is the origin of the English word punch, meaning a mixed drink.
Yes, I like it. Yes.
It's in the Oxford English Dictionary. You can look it up. Yes, so the book details many psychoactive plants which were known to and used by people who called themselves Buddhists.
I mean, one of the things that you detail in the book is this sort of symbolism of the peacock, and the fact that there is the sort of symbolism of poison, of
Yes,
taking in poison, and some of the substances you list, such as datura and so on, are obviously dangerous in any dosage as well. Could be poison
yes,
as well as
yes, indeed.
amrita. So is that a sort of recurring theme, do you think, in some of these medicines, that they're on the edge of being poisonous or helpful, depending on how they're taken and what dose they're
Well,
taken in?
some things like it's possible that certain Himalayan honey was used. There are forms of honey which contain substances called gryanotoxins, which are psychoactive, but it's actually what is known as a subtoxic inebriation. That you feel weird because you're actually poisoning yourself. These the substances like datura, they are explicitly mentioned in the tantras. Not so secret. Datura, camphor, cannabis, these are mentioned, and it is known that that Mahasiddhas took them. For instance, the Mahasiddha, which Buddhists call Jalandharipa, Hindus call him Gorakshanath. He was, legend said he was buried alive for a year, and one of his students has him dug up again. He knows he will have deliberately gone into a coma. So to get him out of the coma, he takes his bag of cannabis and his bag of datura from Jalandharipa's belt and wave them under his nose. And when he smells the datura and cannabis, he comes to again. He comes round. So there is this evidence that datura was used, cannabis was used, but this is kind of exoteric. These are the stuff that they talked about, that people knew about its use. The other stuff was, I think, still secret. The psychedelics.
I mean, the other thing is that I notice on your biography that you're on the advisory board of the Psychedelic Sangha.
Yes, that is true. I haven't been asked for any advice yet.
Yes. I just wondered if there's a interest within American Buddhism in this connection between psychedelics and Buddhism.
People are flocking to it. There are not necessarily Buddhists per se, but we're getting a lot of people who are interested in Buddhism and interested in psychedelics, who are basically saying, really, there's a connection? That's cool. And coming along to the meetings to listen. The Psychedelic Sangha in New York is giving a talk. A guy called Chris Kelly, PhD, is giving a talk on psychedelics in Buddhism based on my book. In a week or two, a couple of weeks, I think, he's giving this talk in New York. Okay. So I will also be giving a talk to the San Francisco chapter of the Psychedelic Sangha around the time when my book comes out. So I'm saving it for then. So yes, there are currently two groups, one in New York and one in San Francisco, but we can see interest in the subject like popping up all over the place.
Yeah, and we met at Breaking Conventions 2 years ago, and there seems to be there's maps in the US as well. There seems to be this research community connected to respectable universities, in trying to find whether there's a medicinal value in psychedelics, trying to do research in consciousness and using psychedelics. So there seems to have been a sudden upsurge in a realization that there is something to investigate here with psychedelics. With that, perhaps after the 60s and 70s when they became banned substances, and there was a sort of backing off from them, there seems to have been a revived interest. In your new edition of the book, you include an account of somebody in clinical conditions taking psilocybin in a high dosage and their experience that they have. There's the account in the DMT, the spirit molecule book, which is, I think, very intriguing on the experiences people had on high doses of DMT. I think all these things sort of beg a lot of questions, really, don't they? From not just from a Buddhist point of view, but from a sort of academic point of view and a medical point of view.
I included that passage purely for those who had no knowledge of the effects, and wanted, I wanted to show that it's not all butterflies and rainbows. It could be absolutely terrifying too.
Yes.
And so I just wanted to give some. I thought it was a nicely written account of a detailed account of a life-changing experience.
Yeah, no, it's a very powerful account, isn't it? Very terrifying account in some ways, but very
yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, maybe we should wrap it up. We've been talking for about 90 minutes, and I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and I've thoroughly enjoyed reading and rereading the book prior to having this conversation with you, Mike. So I wish you all the best for this book and for your various enterprises around it. I mean, maybe just to finish, do you have any more plans for another book or another study, or is there another edition of this?
In fact, I do, and I'm working on another book, which is about. It's a little more controversial. I don't know if how you gauge controversy, but it's about religious transvestism and even castration as suggestions that originally, before the Iron Age, psychedelic plants were a women's secret, and that men had to become women in order to do psychedelic plants. It's based on certain myths, and there are three central myths to it: Krishna, Dionysus, and an obscure Bihari tribal deity called Bir Kuar, who is strangely Bir Kuar in Bihar state in India, and Dionysus share an almost identical myth. It's the sparagmos of King Pentheus in the cycle of Dionysus, described in the Bacchantes by Euripides, and an almost identical myth in northern India. And it's about stealing women's clothes while they are bathing naked or dancing naked. So yes, that should be out in a year or two. I imagine it'll take a couple of years to get it out.
I look forward to that. Maybe you'd like to just tell people about the book, the title, where they can get hold of it, and whether you've got a website where they can find more information and contact you.
It's Secret Drugs of Buddhism. You can find a pre-order page on Amazon. I don't currently have a website devoted to the book. I did. It was hacked and covered with links to Russian sources of Viagra, and which it was completely trashed. I had to take it down. So Synergetic Press is publishing the book. They also publish Dennis McKenna, Ralph Metzner, Alan Bedina. They're a very worthy publisher. Do lots of psychedelic publications and ecological publications if you're interested. So yes, you can find it on Amazon, but it will be in bookshops in Britain. It'll be in Waterson's and similar bookshops in this country. We're hoping to get it into Barnes and Noble and other book chains.
Great. Thank you very much, Mike. This was very enjoyable, and I look forward to speaking to you about your next book when that's out.
Absolutely. I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation myself. So anytime you want another Skype call, we can set one up.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mike. That was fantastic.
You've been listening to the Alchemical Tours podcast by Dr. Stephen Hine. You can subscribe via iTunes, YouTube, Spotify, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Mixcloud, and other well-known platforms. Please do not forget to recommend and rate us. If you have any comments, ideas, or corrections, please do not hesitate to email us at podcast@alchemicaltours.com or contact us via Facebook or Twitter. We always love to hear from you. This podcast is community funded and not for profit. To support us, please subscribe to our Patreon page at patreon.com/alchemicaltours. Until next time, this is the Alchemical Tours podcast, and thank you for listening.